Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining our WSJ book club discussion of Alice Munro's collection of short stories, The Love of a Good Woman. And thank you so much to our author-host, Curtis Sittenfeld, for joining us today. Just before we start, I'd like to announce our next book club pick, which will be Sophie's Choice. Our next author-host will be Lee Child, and we'll be reading Sophie's Choice over the next several weeks. So thank you so much, Curtis, for being here. And I think it would be great just to start if you could give us a little description of the book and sort of why you chose it.
So I'll hold it up here. So Alice Munro is my favorite writer, and she's basically, since I first read her when I was in high school, I just have always loved her stories. People debate whether she's ever written a novel, but she essentially writes stories. I mean, is a collection of linked stories a novel, or is it a story collection? But she writes these long, complicated, ambitious, very rich stories, mostly about people who live in rural Canada, and they're kind of gripping and emotional, and her language is amazing. Although it's not precious amazing. It's actually just amazing in terms of making you feel what you're supposed to feel in that moment.
Yeah. And so when did you first come across her writing? How did you first get into Alice Munro?
Actually, a teacher, when I was in high school, when I was a junior, a teacher said, I went to boarding school, and a teacher said, go into Boston and buy a book by Alice Munro. And I was, generally speaking, I was a very obedient person when I was like 16 or 17, so I did it. And and basically from that moment on, I loved her. It's funny because I feel that she just sort of exists in this place for me where, no offense to any other, I mean, there are amazing other writers out there, but it's just, I feel this, very sort of profound connection to her work, and which actually, to be clear, I think she's a little bit of a writer's writer, and that a lot of writers feel that connection to her work, but she does occupy a different space for me than pretty much all other writers.
Okay, great. And let's talk about this book specifically. When did you first read The Love of a Good Woman?
I read it when I was in graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop, so I don't remember the exact year, but it was between 1999 and 2001.
Mm-hmm. And when you read it, I mean, what were your first impressions of it?
Well, I think the reason I chose this book specifically is I feel like it's sort of, this book is kind of from the golden age of Alice Munro, where I think she just reached this point where her stories were so ambitious and complex and rich. And I will say that a few years after that, her stories became a little bit maybe bleaker or more violent, in a way that, even though I always love and respect her, I didn't love those stories the most of all of hers. But there's, the title story in here, which is now, of course, now that I'm doing this live, I can't remember exactly. I'm going to look at how many pages it is, but it's incredibly long, which is, let's see, it's 78 pages, which, to some people they might say, that's not a short story, that's a novella. But I love the funny thing about this story, about this story collection, is that the one word I might use to describe it is sordid. Like, I feel like there's tons of scandalous things that happen in all the stories, and of course I remembered loving this book the first time around, but then I did have this moment where I thought, what does that say about me, that all these kind of, slightly obscene, like violent or sexual things happen in these stories, but it makes them pretty gripping and dramatic.
Yeah. But I think one of the things that I found most interesting about it is that the violence and the sexual tension is so subtle in a lot of the stories. Can you talk a little bit about how she sort of weaves that in subtly, so that you almost don't even realize until, it hits you over the head at certain moments?
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously we sort of, as people, we tend to respond to an individual story more than a more generic. So if you said, a person died, in a car accident in Texas today, even though that's sad, I think most people wouldn't necessarily like weep for that, but the more personal details you gave about that, I think the more you would think, oh my God, that's horrible, and how did that affect that person's family? And Alice Munro does a sort of fictional version of that where she makes these people so real and so alive, and then she brings in this dramatic twist about what happens to them, and you're so invested in them, and they seem so much like real people that it is very disturbing or shocking, or in some cases it's very exciting. Like there are some, kind of quasi-happy endings in these stories, and you think, oh, I'm so glad that that person, found the love of his or her life. So it's yeah, I do think that she just, in a way that is, she writes long short stories, but compared to a novelist, which is more what I am, she's actually very succinct in creating three-dimensional people in a relatively short amount of space.
Yeah, I think one of the main things that we've been talking about over the course of the month reading this book is the short story form and sort of how that impacts her storytelling. What kind of influence do you think the short story format really has on the themes that she's talking about?
Well, one of the things that I admire about Alice Munro is that she's sort of a rule breaker, or she does things that you shouldn't be able to do. And one very concrete example of that is that in the last story, My Mother's Dream, she tells the story from the point of view seemingly of an adult woman describing her own infancy and knowing details that no infant could ever remember. But it's told so convincingly and grippingly that you just kind of go along for the ride. And I love how Alice Munro does it. Or another thing, in the title story, which as we established is 78 pages, I think you have to get maybe 30 pages in before you're essentially introduced to the main character in that short story. And so a lot of what she does is almost defying the form or showing how flexible the form can be, and that it doesn't have to just depict some small or brief event. Like it can encapsulate an entire life.
Right. Okay, great. So sort of we're going to start taking reader questions, and one of the first ones was something we've sort of touched on before, but this is from Anne Cow, and she says, my impression of Alice Munro is that she mostly writes in a very subtle way about the twin monsters lurking in the undertows of the human experience, sex and death. The effect is unsettling and unnerving and thrilling. Is this impression correct?
Well, first of all, I don't think I like to pass myself off as an Alice Munro expert, but I'm not. It's not like I get to say whether something is, correct or not. Like if that's, your impression, sure. But I do agree with that impression, and I think that that's why her stories are basically so juicy and interesting, is that they do deal with big topics. And I mean, she does this amazing job of blending the sort of mundane daily life and what people eat and maybe their minor health irritations, and then these kind of shocking, dramatic things that happen, like drownings and murder and adultery. And so it's a blend. But I do think that the big issues are there. As a side note, actually, one time a poet friend of mine told me that I don't know if he agreed with this, but he said there's this idea that all poems are about either sex or death, which is, whether or not that's accurate, it's an interesting way to read poems, or an interesting way to read Alice Munro stories. And you could be like, this is a sex one, this is a death one, or both.
Great. So here's kind of a short, funny question that I like. What do you think the title of The Love of a Good Woman has to do with the title story, which is also called The Love of a Good Woman?
Well, titles are an interesting thing because, obviously people have, different writers, I guess, choose their titles for different reasons. And I would almost say that I think the title is meant to evoke a kind of mood more than I think it maybe means anything literal. I do think it means, so the main character is Enid in the book, and I think she is a good woman, although what I love about her is that that she's, and this is something that's always true of Alice Munro characters. So there's great debate in the literary community about what makes a character likable, or whether characters should be likable. And of course, this debate comes up much more around female characters created by female writers.
Right.
And I think that Alice Munro, as far as I can tell, does not concern herself greatly with whether her characters are likable. They happen to be likable to me. I think they're probably not likable to some people, but they're never supposed to be like quirky or goofy, or sort of like charming in ways that they themselves are unaware of. They're more like so Enid is basically a nurse who takes care of very sick people in their home, and this is, I'm not sure actually what the time period is. I think it's, let's say it's like 50 years ago or something. But she's simultaneously, she's a hard worker, but then it also goes into, she's having all these kind of obscene dreams at night about all kinds of disgusting things. So it's not like, oh, isn't she this sort of innocent, charming woman? So she's a very complicated person, but she is a good woman, and it is sort of about this love that she feels for someone else, which in certain ways is forbidden. So I feel like it's sort of a literal title, but then it's also, the phrase itself seems old-fashioned in the ways that Alice Munro's stories can seem old-fashioned in setting, although I don't think in emotion.
Yeah, on the subject of women characters in the book, here's a question from Nancy Burton, who commented on Facebook, and she says, I would like to know what Curtis thinks about Alice Munro's views of women's roles and the passions and needs that determine their life choices, and if you think that that these views presented in her stories are different from other women writers.
Well, I think, so I've never met Alice Munro, and I don't, you can only infer, obviously, based on reading people's work, but it seems like she is interested in the general topic of the way that women's lives are constrained, and especially how they were more constrained in the 50s or the 60s, and how, in some ways, it's actually really interesting because a lot of her characters make these dramatic choices, I think, because of the constraints of their life or in reaction to. So it's kind of like, they're not supposed to have sex before marriage, and so they have random sex with a stranger on a train, almost like because they can't like do it with their boyfriend, and or they have to be stay-at-home mothers, even though I think that in the time she's describing, the term stay-at-home mother doesn't even exist. But so therefore they leave their marriage as a way of addressing their unhappiness or their sense of entrapment, instead of getting a part-time job or whatever someone might do today. So I think that she's always writing with that as the sort of subtext, but she doesn't really explicitly delve into things in a kind of political way. And I think that of course every writer has political views or views on current issues, but I think sometimes if your foremost objective is to convey your views, I think that that's more appropriate for nonfiction, or it can feel like propaganda. And I think if you're writing fiction, I don't know, maybe this is an incendiary statement, but I think that fiction tends to work best when your main goal is to tell a story, to create characters, and then the politics sort of bubble up within that.
Hmm. Interesting. Sort of moving towards your work, we had a question from Wendy Sierra, who wrote on Facebook, and she says, Curtis, how close is Lee Fiora, who is your heroine in Prep, to anyone we might have read in this Alice Munro collection?
Well, something that I know there's been some online discussion about this prior to today, that Alice Munro's stories can be very confusing. And the advice I always give, which I follow myself, is when you're trying to orient yourself in a story, as you're reading, take notes on who the characters are, what the time period is, what the setting is, because a lot of times it's less complicated than it initially seems, but she'll introduce you to 7 people at once. And so, by the way, I will, this is my love of a good woman envelope that has all my notes about like stories um, and anyway, so, but a lot of times another way to orient yourself that's potentially simpler is when you get to this, usually a young woman who's smart and kind of out of place or maybe different from people around her, not necessarily in like the awkward way, but more in that maybe she's a little bit more observant than they are, or has this great appetite for life or this ambition or curiosity about the world that they don't share. That's when you've reached the center of an Alice Munro story, and that's 9 times out of 10 that's your main character. I will say, in terms of influencing me or my character of Lee Fiora, I do think that my stance on likability has probably been influenced by Alice Munro, where I do think, and I feel so much admiration for this, as Alice Munro writes, I basically think she does whatever she wants. She goes down whatever weird path she wants to. She doesn't try really hard to make her character likable. And the fact is, plenty of readers, despite her having won the Nobel Prize, plenty of readers don't like Alice Munro's work. But so I think that I think that I might try to be a little bit more of a people pleaser in some of my writing, but I just feel like she like writes the story that's inside of her that she wants to write, and she's not trying to sort of appeal to the widest or the lowest common denominator. And the likability thing, I think, is especially big in that equation.
Yeah, I know that a lot of readers sort of found some of these stories challenging, and could you talk a little bit about like why they might be challenging for some readers, just in general?
So literally, I think they're confusing at the level of what's happening. So if someone said to me, "What happened in this story?" to describe the plot in 2 sentences might be challenging. And honestly, the truth is that, because her story is like, it's like a young woman on a train in rural Ontario. Like, if you said that, like, that applies to so many stories, that if you said to me, "Oh, what about such and such story?" just by title, I might think, wait, which one is that? So it's like, they are, just in terms of like, people focusing or like occupying space in your brain, they're complicated. And I think that they pay off. Those complications are sort of worth it, but they're not easy, and plenty of like fiction. I think reading fiction is considered by most people to be a leisure activity, and maybe not everyone wants their brain to hurt or something. But I would say that I think I sort of forgot to say part 2 of my recommendation for reading Alice Munro, which is, 1, take notes, like maybe 5 sentences worth of notes on, or like 3 sentences worth of notes on each story, and then finish the story, and then read it a second time, and at that point you know what happens. And so just enjoy the language, enjoy the twists and turns, the character development, and don't feel like you're just sort of, and also kind of trust yourself to understand. Like, a lot of times people will say to me about my own work, they'll say, what's the message? And it's like, often it doesn't have a message. It's just kind of a slice of life, or an episode, or it's about the mysteries of being alive. But it's not the mysteries of being alive that boil down into this one sentence.
Right. And I think another thing that contributes to that is that a lot of these stories are really, really sad. I mean, this isn't really light summer reading, really fun, So, and you called her writing sort of totally devastating in the wonderful way of great fiction. Can you talk about how she kind of achieves this really amazing emotional effect?
Well, I think the sort of perspective that underlies a lot of her stories seems to be this acceptance that, we kind of, we like, put on our clothes and brush our teeth and sort of like smile and go out into the world and try to act normal, but that there's this underlying all kinds of like menace and savagery, and people's peaceful lives are kind of precarious. And I think that there are plenty of people who don't want to believe that, and don't want to read fiction that suggests that's true. And so I can see, just in terms of sensibility, that from the outset, maybe there are people who would have difficulty or just wouldn't consider it a pleasure to kind of, you know, dip into that world. But if you basically share that perspective about how precarious it all is, or how there's, I mean, one thing that I also admire her for is when she there's in the title story, there's a character who's very sick, and she basically talks about all the, you know, sort of unsavory physical bodily details that exist, and then how there's this sort of pretense, basically after the person dies, that the things weren't as messy and you know, sort of physically messy and emotionally messy and unpleasant as they were before she died. And I think that, you know, I guess I sort of share that somewhat dark view that life is, if you're really describing the human body and what it goes through, that there is a lot that's kind of like gross or sad, and it's part of life, you know, so why wouldn't it be in fiction?
Right, right. So here's a question from Chloe. She says, she wrote on Twitter and she said, what is your favorite story and why?
So my favorite, I knew this question was coming, I'll admit, and so I think I have 3 favorite stories. So in Open Secrets, which is this collection, there's a story called The Albanian Virgin that I like love. It's this very kind of structurally complicated story that it just has amazing details, and I love. Actually, it's a great story to read in terms of thinking about gender and maybe what issues are interesting to Alice Munro. Then one of the earlier collections, friend of my youth, there's a story called Goodness and Mercy that I also like. Love. And then there's a story in the collection which I somehow, like, it fell on the floor or something, but it's in the collection called Runaway, and the story is called Tricks, and it basically, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's like the most devastating story I think I've ever read. Like, I feel like I've devoted weeks of my life to being upset about what happens to some fictional characters. It's so good. So it's called Tricks, and it's in Runaway.
And what about in this particular collection? Do you have a favorite from The Love of a Good Woman?
I don't think there's a bad one in the bunch. Like, I think I love the ambition of the title story. I love the story Before the Change, which is sort of written as, it's kind of written as a series of letters that are, I think the implication is, that are never sent. And so it has this sort of weird, like, it has this kind of chatty first-person structure, although it's also, the letters are not really letters. I mean, they're much more descriptive, where they have these long paragraphs and scenes. Right. I love My Mother's Dream, which is that story that's sort of told from the infant's point of view. And I mean, one thing that was really interesting for me, so as I said, I probably read this collection, you know, 13 years ago for the first time, and there's a fair amount about motherhood in here that I was not a mother the first time I read it, and I am a mother now. And of course, because she nails everything, Alice Munro totally nails motherhood too. It's no surprise.
Yeah. Sort of on that note, we have a question from Alyssa Perlman-Taub, who wrote on Facebook, and she says that, you know, as an author who has explored coming-of-age issues in your own work, can you comment on Miss Munro's treatment of coming-of-age in this collection?
Well, I think this story, now I'm going to not be able to remember, Rich as Stink is the title. I think that's maybe the best coming-of-age story in here. I mean, I think that Alice Munro does a really good job, of course, depicting, you know, adolescent longing and intensity of emotion and awkwardness, but never doing it in a cliched way. Like, that's the thing, that her work is simultaneously, I hate to say old-fashioned, because I think that's off-putting to people and makes it sound sort of dusty, or like it smells like a violet sachet or something. But it's really like fresh and alive, and yet it has all this stuff about the past. So it doesn't. you know, she just like she like never gets within 10 feet of a cliche. That in itself might be a cliche that I'm saying, but she does evoke adolescence in this way that feels very real and believable.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that we talked about when we first discussed this book was kind of the efficiency she's able to accomplish in her stories. Like she can set up a whole town dynamic in a couple of pages, and it feels like a novel, but it's just a couple of pages, you know. So could you talk a bit about her pacing and kind of how she manages to do that?
Well, I think she is incredible at selecting details that carry a lot of weight. So she just chooses a few, whether it's you know, what the characters eat, or like what their house smells like, or maybe some of the most, like one or two of the most closely held beliefs that a character has, which are often misguided beliefs. And so she's very sort of elegant in selecting her details, and they're very evocative, and they do a lot of work. And then something she also does in a really bold way is she understands the drama inherent in the passage of time, and so she'll jump, you know, many decades. And so it's like we get situated, we get to know these particular characters, and then, you know, we see them 40 years later and all this stuff has changed. And so that's one way of kind of cramming, like she basically bypasses years and years of a person's life. That's one way of kind of controlling her pacing and creating drama. But honestly, as someone like my novels tend to be on the long side, and I think that if I don't think I fully understand how she packs so much into a limited amount of space, because if she did, I would imitate it more than I have. There is this kind of magical quality, and which as a reader, that's actually a really great feeling. Like I had the sort of realization recently, like maybe in the last year or so, where I thought to myself, I don't want to read any book that I feel like I'm capable of writing without doing any research. So it's like fine if I could write that book, but I would have to do 5 years of research first, then I'm willing to read it. But I just don't want to read something that doesn't give me some like greater intelligence that I possess than I possess myself. And I do feel like that feeling of thinking, how did she do that, is actually an exciting feeling as a reader, and I admire that. Like, I don't want to be able to kind of break it down. I mean, I do and I don't want to be able to break it down and figure out exactly how she did it.
Right, right. And are there any tricks on the level of the sentence that you've picked up from her, little tips on like technical things?
Actually, it's funny because I think at the level of sentence is probably where I've been most influenced by her, and it hasn't been conscious on my part. But she does things like sometimes she asks a series of questions, like so it'll be like, and it's potentially in the third person, sometimes in the first person, but it'll almost be like this omniscient narrative voice saying, you know, why had he done that? Had he known that she would, you know, be away for the next 6 months or whatever? And I think that asking a series of questions is something that I, you know, sort of unconsciously or subconsciously have borrowed from her. And then she also, sometimes she'll just say, she'll vary long sentences and short sentences, which other writers do, but I think she does it particularly effectively in this way that kind of packs a punch. Or so it'll be like, you know, long sentence, and then the next sentence will just be the word no. You know? and she situates the reader really deeply inside the character's head, and kind of, you know, really makes you see things from the character's perspective, which again makes the characters seem like real people.
Yeah, we have a question here from Stephen Zahn about narration, and he says, I wonder if you think it's of any significance whether Alice Munro's stories are told by one of the characters or told in a kind of third-person omniscient narrator voice. Like, how does that change the story?
I don't think it really changes the story that much, because so if it's in the third person, Alice Munro tends to make it very personal or go deep inside for that character. And if it's in the first person, she tends to make it very personal and, you know, go deep inside the mind of that character. So I don't think there's a tremendous difference. I mean, there are people, like when I was in graduate school, I don't want to misquote, but I believe the head of the Iowa Writers Workshop at that point was Frank Conroy, who was this very wise, wonderful man. And my impression is that he felt like everything should be written in the third person unless there's a major justification otherwise. And I personally actually prefer writing and probably reading in the first person, all things being equal, because I feel like people write, they're just much more interior. They tend to be more interior when it's in the first person. But I think that Alice Munro is equally interior, whether it's third or first. And this is really getting like kind of like geeky writer technical, you know, whatever.
No, it's great. And then we have a question from Ashley May, who wrote on Twitter, and she says, who would you consider Alice Munro's peers? What other authors sort of influenced her, and where is her kind of literary home?
Oh, it's interesting to think what other authors influenced her. I don't know, but she talks a lot about other books. Like this is so a lot of times in fiction, I feel annoyed when the character is a writer or even a big reader because it feels self-conscious. I feel like I can feel the presence of the writer, and sometimes it even feels lazy. It's like, okay, at the least, just make your character a painter instead of a writer. You know, because it's as if the author is familiar with the rhythms of a writer's life, and so that's why they're just like, okay, I'll just use that. But I never feel that way with her, of course, because she can get away with anything. But I will say that a writer who I think is almost like so there's a British writer named Tessa Hadley who's a novelist and a short story writer, and her stories are often published in the New Yorker, as are Alice Munro's. And I think that there are some Tessa Hadley stories that I could read and think that Alice Munro, like if the name were removed from it, I might think that it had been written by Alice Munro. And I don't think there's almost anyone else I would say that about. I've definitely seen in blurbs or reviews other comparisons of, you know, saying someone like, this is Alice Munrovian, and usually I read it and I'm like, no, it's not, you know, like, and I also, to be clear, I don't consider myself, I'm influenced by her, but I don't think that someone would necessarily look at our writing side by side and see that influence the way I'm aware of it.
Right, right. So just to go back to this specific book, we have a question from Carol, who wrote on Facebook, and she said that she would like to hear Curtis's reasons for selecting this book and what about it so appealed to her. Just briefly, if you could go back to that.
Briefly, no. I just feel like the stories are so engrossing. They're so rich. You know, I like the characters. I care about them. There's maybe, I mean, again, there's so many things that Alice Munro does well, but maybe the number one thing that she does really well is she describes feelings that people have or dynamics between one or more people that you think couldn't be described. Like, you think there are no words to describe that because it's so kind of subtle and nameless, and it's this feeling that, like, I've never described to another person, and she does. And it's like literally probably that happens once on every page in this collection, where it's just like, it's so perceptive about human nature. So I think, I mean, I could have chosen other collections, but I think that maybe this is the collection where every story is like a knockout.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. She knocks it out of the park. It's when I try to use sports analogies, it becomes very awkward.
Well, something that I kind of noticed was that there's like a climax that happens somewhere in each of the stories, it seems like, but it can be internal. And then you had said sort of that it's often tied to an external event as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's interesting because she does write, she never spoon feeds the reader. She never makes things easy. And so there are times when like, for example, the story Before the Change, the main character, there's, one, she seems to find something out about her father that she never realized, like kind of late in life. Two, she reveals something about herself. And then three, she realizes something about this person that her family knew. So there's kind of like three bombshells. But you have to be reading very closely to understand that they've all been dropped. Again, it's a strange choice to make, where so many writers kind of lead with what's most dramatic, or like they have a hook or something, where there are times when she just like loads up all these domestic details or daily details, and then almost buries the lead, I guess you would say, and it's like, oh my God, that's a shocking story, but we had to read about like this woman baking pies for like 19 pages before we got to it. And I just, in this weird way, she manipulates readers in a way that I like to be manipulated, I guess. I don't know how strange that sounds, but she's controlling the pace. She's controlling when she reveals the information. And it's also, maybe in life, I think there's something more interesting about people who don't reveal their weirdness right away. And her work seems like that. Like, it's like she has shocking things to tell you, but she doesn't hit you with them right off.
Right. So we have a question from Kathleen from WSJ.com, and she would like to know what exactly the significance of the line, "The present king of France is bald."
So this is actually from the story that we were just talking about, Before the Change. Let's see. And I haven't been a teacher for a while, but I'm like going into teacher. I believe on page 292. So, I mean, again, we could probably spend 45 minutes talking about that line, but I would say it's sort of an inside joke, essentially, that so that's the story that we're referring to, is the one that's written in the form of a letter or a series of started but not completed letters. And I think that line is an inside joke, and it sort of hints at the tone of the relationship to the letter's recipient or would-be recipient, and kind of shows this, like, basically, against spoiler alert, but like, that the relationship no longer exists, so it makes it sort of poignant that they had this kind of sweetness between them, or this joking aspect. And I think that line, in a way, I mean, obviously it refers explicitly to the way that the two characters met, the letter writer and the letter recipient. And I think that there's an element of nonsense to that sentence, which also gets at, like, when you say, like, what's the point of something, or what's the meaning of something, it's almost like if you could say clearly what the point or meaning of a line is, or a story is, or a novel is, you would just write that line. Like, you would just create a bumper sticker. You wouldn't write a novel. And so I think there's some element of it's nonsense. It's like saying the unsayable, which is, kind of referring to an inside joke between two people and the dynamic between two people.
Great, thank you.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. No, we also have a question from Stephen Zahn, who asks, why do you think Alice Munro rewrites her stories so often?
So I think this question is, why does she sort of return to similar subject matter very often? And I would say, actually, as opposed to literally rewriting the same story. I mean, I don't know how often she does that, but I think that so I one time interviewed the fiction writer Antonia Nelson, and she quoted, I think it had been a professor of hers, who said, as a writer, you don't have to announce your obsessions, they will announce themselves. And I've thought so much, I mean, this interview that I conducted was like 12 years ago, so I've thought very often about this line. And I think that it's like she's interested in sort of, young women leaving home. She's interested in issues of class. She's interested in how marriage can be, like very comforting, and it can also be entrapping, and you know how in the 50s or 60s or 70s how women had many fewer choices, and so I think those happen to be her obsessions. I'm not sure that she has a narrower set of obsessions than most other writers.
I see. And I think this is going to be our last question. So if you had a reader that really likes Alice Munro and likes her style, that kind of devastating effect, and also these themes that we've been talking about, do you have any suggestions of other books or other writers that you might also enjoy?
So I think that probably my number one, well, there's Tessa Hadley, who I think is very similar to Alice Munro, and then I also think Mona Simpson is very similar to Alice Munro in terms of you know, dwelling a lot on what's interior, and I mean I really like, I mean I like a lot of Mona Simpson's books. She has a novel called My Hollywood that I especially like loved recently, and then another writer who I think is primarily a short story, I don't think she's written any novels, is a writer named Andrea Lee, and she also writes in this very kind of, there's just this like sharpness of intelligence that you don't always find in all stories, but I think Mona Simpson, Andrea Lee, and Tessa Hadley are all people that I would recommend.
Great, thank you. And is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to discuss?
I don't think we left any Alice Munro stone unturned.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and submitting your questions.
Thank you, Anna.
All right.